is going to be, well, this is one way to solve it. And I don't even know how you're going to send me over the file. It's going to be it's going to be huge. But okay, well, without further ado, I'm going to get it started.
That's a problem for future us.
Yeah, and we can't see each other like during this meeting, so we'll just have to pretend and be like, I get what you're talking about. Hello, fellow peacemaker. Welcome back to episode 12 of Make Peace Not Beef. This is your host, Lily, and today I brought on to the show the founder of Last Minute Gear, James Dawn. He's an entrepreneur based in the Bay Area and also a former consultant at Bain & Company. And I'm really excited to have James on the show today because he's going to be talking to us about circular economy, degrowth, and how we can induce a shift in our collective mindset as consumers toward a more sustainable lifestyle. So without further ado, I would like to welcome James to the show and let him introduce himself.
Hi, Lily. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be on this podcast. As you mentioned, I live in the Bay Area currently, but I grew up in Texas and I came out here for school originally. So I went to Berkeley and I studied environmental economics and policy, business, city planning, and Chinese. And I definitely will say it was kind of a culture shock coming from Texas to here. So when I was in high school, I was in a extracurricular club that was called Natural Legacy. And we had a lot of excursions into the outdoors. So a lot of camping trips, backpacking trips, and a lot of kayaking trips especially. So that was really what stoked my passion for the environment and my desire to get more involved. So I worked on a lot of projects with Natural Legacy, but also just independently tinkering and trying to figure out how can I do more to mainly recycle. When I moved to Berkeley, I realized that recycling was really the tip of the iceberg. That was the first time that I was exposed to all these different things you can do, like composting, which I'd previously never really thought about. And for example, shopping local, shopping sustainable, all these buzzwords were very much outside my radar until I came here. So that was a very interesting transition. And it's something that I've continued to foster and continue to build because the environmental studies is something that I took on in college. And then even thereafter, I tried to involve myself with that at my last consulting firm. And then of course, now I do that full time with Last Minute Gear.
Wow, that's incredible. So I did not know you were from Texas. Like, I've always thought you were born and raised in California.
Yeah, people do think that a lot.
So now I kind of want to segue into the first topic of our discussion today. It's going to be about circular and sharing economy. So James, can you tell us the basics of circular and sharing economy and what each is and why they are the key drivers of environmental sustainability?
Sure, of course, I'd love to. I'd like to start with the whole key driver of environmental sustainability first, because I think it helps set a nice foundation. Very broadly, there are two types of environmental activism. So one school of thought is we are going to lean completely into technology, and technology is going to plug in the gaps where we mitigate the effects that our behaviors cause. The other group is very much around technology is great, but we fundamentally need to change our behaviors. And I think, Lily, you said this yourself in one of your other podcasts about technology, but there really needs to be moderation. There needs to be a balance between both of these. For example, we can rely on technology to reduce the amount of waste that we produce and hopefully recycle more, but is this forever, right? Like, are we going to recycle forever and ever and ever? If you are an adherent of the precautionary principle, then maybe we should leverage some of this technology, sure, but also look at the behaviors that we have today. And so circular economy and sharing economy are two types of economies, two types of practices that can underlie certain business models, which is why the economy word is added to it. So circular economy is very focused on reducing waste. And it's reducing waste from the byproduct and from the end product. So it's very focused on the beginning of a product life cycle and the end of a product life cycle. Whereas sharing economy is very focused on increasing the utilization of that product during its life cycle. And so let me give you an example of how the two can be somewhat similar, but not the same. So if I buy a water bottle that is reusable and I decide that I don't want this anymore and I give it to you and you use it for a bit, you decide you don't want it anymore, and you give it to someone else. We are collectively engaging in a sharing economy practice. And there are sharing economy startups that allow people to share like this in this manner. So that's great. We're increasing the utilization of this asset that we already have in the world, which is a reusable water bottle. However, at the end of its life, what happens to the reusable water bottle? If it's plastic, even if it's the good type of plastic, BPA free and doesn't leach, that's great for your health while you're using it, but plastic recycling isn't a closed loop. And what that means is that plastic recycling doesn't and can't go on forever. Plastic bottles don't get recycled back into plastic bottles.
Mhm.
They often get recycled into plastic pellets that have a bunch of industrial applications. And then at the end, those plastic pellets end up going into a landfill. So even though we've increased the utilization of this bottle, which is a very sharing economy practice, having a plastic bottle wouldn't be a very good example of a circular economy practice.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yes. I just want to highlight the fact that, there is a cost to recycling too, especially there is a cost to upcycling, right? You
Mhm.
take this one piece of plastic or glass, whatever, you have to break it down and then you have to regenerate it into
Right.
virgin plastic again. Like there's a cost associated with that. Mm-hmm.
I totally agree with that. And a lot of people forget that when you recycle something, try to upcycle it, there's a water cost, a manufacturing cost, an energy
Mm-hmm.
cost, because you're essentially trying to give life to this product again.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Thanks, James, for providing definitions of circular and sharing economy. So now that we know what they are, could you please provide a couple of specific examples and relevant applications of circular and sharing economy that we already observe in our daily life?
Yeah, for sure. People always think that just because there's a new buzzword, there must be a ton of newness and novelty around it. But the
Mhm.
reality is that we've been using sharing economy services all the time. So the hotel industry, the car rental industry
Yeah.
are essentially sharing economy because we're trying to take an asset that we already have and reuse it as many times as possible. Now, you could argue that, well, those assets were built specifically for the purpose of sharing. Are there examples of sharing economy services that rely on existing assets? And there are as well. So the counterpart to that would be Airbnb or VRBO, vacation rentals by owner. So it's taking an existing asset that someone already owns and trying to increase utilizations of that. Another example with a different pair of businesses is, is the asset net new or is it already in play? So this would be, for example, car rentals versus casual carpool. The
Mhm.
casual carpool is a big thing in the Bay, not right now because of COVID, but it was a big thing in the Bay Area where people line up in the financial district at designated places and people who are driving home or driving to work, usually it's very commute oriented,
Mhm.
will go and pick up someone and drop them off, wherever it is they want to go. And it's casual in the sense that there's no app that governs this. It's just an informal line that everyone knows to line up at. The monetary transactions also very casual. You negotiate something in the car on your way over there. So that's very much, this car already exists. We already are making this trip. So this is not net new in any way.
Mhm.
Versus a car rental service, that car is net new. And even looking at Lyft and Uber, this is really interesting because Lyft and Uber are often hailed as the perfect example of sharing economy services. But if you think about from this dimension, is the asset net new, is the transaction net new? When you're calling a Lyft or Uber, nowadays you are calling that driver to pick you up specifically and to drop you off
Mhm.
specifically.
Right.
That's not a route that the driver was already doing because they're running their own errand. So in that way, that trip is still net new. And the last dimension that I think about sharing economy is, does the platform enable resharing or is it more of a one way? So an example here might be of a tool lending library. We actually don't have one in San Francisco, but there is one in Berkeley, and I've used that one before.
Wow.
Well, tool lending library is completely free. It's usually run by public libraries. You check out a tool and you bring it back. Obviously, a perfect example would be a regular library for books. So it's a
Yeah.
platform that fundamentally enables resharing and promotes resharing versus, for example, Goodwill or a used goods store where very much it's a one-way transaction. I think the most important thing to remember is, even though these are three key dimensions to analyze sharing economy, so the first one being who owns the asset, the second one being is the asset net new, and the third one being does a platform enable, promote resharing, or is it more of a one-way transaction?
Mhm.
Better is subjective. So it's not always that one is better than the other because it really depends on the situation. For example, when I was talking about Lyft and Uber and that being largely a net new transaction because it's a net new trip that is being taken, that's not necessarily a bad thing because there are also studies that show that Lyft and Uber have made a meaningful difference in reducing the percentage of cars on the road. I think what's interesting is that you're seeing a new crop of studies that say that Lyft and Uber may also be increasing the amount of traffic on the road. So now it's this really interesting dynamic between, are we reducing more carbon emissions from taking out vehicles and from taking out vehicle stalling and vehicles driving around the same block over and over again looking for parking? Are we taking more out than we're putting in by increasing traffic from having more Lyft and Uber drivers on the road? And I think a lot of these are to be seen as we study them more in the long term. And then in terms of circular economy, so I love food waste. I mean, let me phrase that.
You love food waste. Don't we all?
I hate food waste, but I love thinking about food waste as an issue that I wish weren't an issue because in many ways it's just such a silly problem. And it's a problem really based in an inability to distribute properly because we waste so much food, right? So there's a really interesting app. It's based in the UK, but it's called the Olio app, Olio. And it's an app that allows you to share leftover food that you have. So maybe you had a dinner party and you made too much. Or maybe you had, like a marathon baking session and you baked too much. This is a really way to give it to a neighbor.
This is so great. But here's the thing though, and here is the implicit thing that kind of underpins all these systems, which is trust. Like, how do you trust a stranger, right? When you're sharing a car or when you're staying at someone else's house because they're hosting an Airbnb, how do you trust that stranger and trust that they're not going to poison you with their food or...
Yeah, you bring up such a good point. It's very hard. We no longer live in a world, unfortunately, where we know our neighbors, right? Like I remember when I was young, I made friends with my neighbors because I was a curious child and I would just knock on their door and ask them stuff and talk to them when I saw them.
Yeah.
And today we don't really do that much anymore. We don't know our neighbors. We don't really have these community connections that we used to. And so a lot of businesses in this space have realized that they have to come in and they have to be the arbiter of that trust. So they come in and they build out review platforms, which is what you see with Lyft and Uber, right? You have ratings for drivers and ratings for passengers. That's what's made this really challenging. So a lot of sharing economy services that started out super community driven have had to become more business-like, more scalable, business-like, taking away some of those dimensions that I mentioned that made them truly sharing because they need to be a little bit more presentable in a way that fosters trust to someone who's had no exposure to these things before.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the story, but the former CEO of Airbnb, and when he first founded Airbnb, he couldn't get anyone to trust the system. So what he had to do was he actually had to physically visit every single posting down the block. And he had to live there and be the first reviewer of all of the newcomers to the system. It was tough. And nowadays Airbnb is an empire, but back then, trust is one of the hardest things to build in our society. I totally agree with you. And to your point, nowadays, even though everyone is connected on social media, we rarely talk to people that we're physically close to anymore. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. I totally agree with that. As part of Airbnb garnering that trust, as part of the founder doing these reviews himself, in order to do that, it's just hard to be a mom and pop that just owns a single location, right? And so that's why you're seeing these articles that saying that less than half of Airbnb hosts have a single dwelling. And in fact, 20% of them have more than 10 listings. And so that's something where you look at that and you think, James mentioned that one of the dimensions to think about sharing economy is the asset net new or not? But people are buying up property to list on Airbnb. So is that actually making a positive difference in the world? And that's the inherent struggle here. Because in many ways, I think Airbnb and many of these sharing economy services discovered that in order to be viable as a business, because of trust, because of other dimensions, because of finances, they have to engage in some of these behaviors that are no longer just super hippy dippy community feeling, touching and feeling, you know?
Yeah, no, you touched on a great point. I actually know people like property owners who are extremely rich. They bought up property just so they can rent it out as Airbnb. So that's kind of defeating the purpose of, sharing your property when it now they have now monopolized, all the properties. So my question is, do you think in that case it presents a bigger challenge of inequality in our society?
Absolutely. I mean, I totally think it does, because you're allowing asset owners to increase assets even more and to accumulate wealth from these assets. So for me, actually, one of the important other dimensions to look at is how is this service reducing inequality, reducing that gap by increasing access to resources versus not. And that's a sharing economy dimension that, I think a lot of, maybe if you are an investor, that might not be something that you look at because it's not financially related, but that's something that's super inherent to me and inherent to how I think about managing the perverse incentives of my business. So the best example I can give you is there's some service that allows to share private jets. Do we look at that and do we fundamentally think, oh, what a great service for increasing access of resources into the world and building equity, right?
Yeah,
And I
for
think
the super rich. Mm-hmm.
Right, exactly. And frankly, it's even also really weird because I feel like if you're super rich, you might not want to share a private jet in the first place. So in other words, it's for the medium rich.
Oh
for the
God,
people
that is
who are
true.
climbing that ladder, right? And so, it's interesting, companies like Walmart and companies like Amazon and their malpractices when it comes to treating their employees and treating their warehouse workers specifically with fairness. And so then people say, oh, well, it's this cycle because you're not paying people well. And so they don't have a lot of resources themselves. And so when they need to shop, they go back and they shop at the same place. And they kind of fuel these businesses because it's a very privileged thing to say, to tell someone, hey, don't shop at XYZ place because they have bad practices. Because sometimes that price differential between buying something at Walmart versus buying something at a place that is very sustainable and everything is made with perfect practices from a labor perspective and perfect materials, that price differential can be huge. And so for me, sharing economy should bridge that gap. Because if someone can't afford to buy the sustainably crafted option because it's too expensive, is there an alternative? Could they, for example, timeshare it? Could they rent it? Could they use it for part of the time so they can still have access to that good? And that's a really critical dimension, I think, for evaluating sharing economy services. A lot of these things have to kind of move together, right? Like at the same time, you need to have these higher end, more reusable items. You have to have people producing them, which is why there are a lot of other shared terms that people talk about. So people talk about slow economy, so slow food, slow fashion, which is very much designed to counter this single-use throwaway concept that we very much have.
Wait a second. What is slow food?
Slow food is counted as fast food. It was about getting people to cook more. It was about getting people to shop more locally, to eat more seasonally. And so it's just a buzzword, but it wasn't very novel because the things that folded up under it, we already knew. It was just rebranding.
Things that take time to prepare, but cost less environmental harm, I guess.
Right. Things that are more intentional. It was, like slow food, I think, also had a lot of relations with intentionality and just this other movement that's going on around being conscientious about the practices that you take on a day-to-day basis. As Marie Kondo would say, it's like sparks joy, right?
No, I like that. Are you a fan of Marie Kondo?
It's interesting. I've actually never watched the show, and I feel like I should watch the show.
Oh, yes, thanks.
Have you seen the show?
Yeah, like one episode of it. I mean, I also speak Japanese, so.
Oh, okay. What did you think of the show?
It's really great. For a lot of people, it's very therapeutic, right? It's like one of those home makeover shows, except, she's very methodical, so you actually learn something from it that you can apply in your own life.
Obviously, I agree very much with the fundamental concept of minimalism. So
Exactly.
there's
I was
actually,
going to say that.
yeah.
Downsizing. Mm-hmm.
So there's a duo in the US, they're called the Minimalists. And they wrote a book called Everything That Remains. And it's a book that explores their journey into minimalism. And while it does talk about the environmental benefits of not buying a bunch of stuff, it also talks about the therapeutic and psychological benefits from the catharsis of being able to remove your emotional dependence on
Yeah.
objects. I'm a person that's very cognizant of perverse and unintended consequences. So I'm always very wary, is someone using Marie Kondo or minimalist practices as a way to purge and then get more stuff? Because that's not necessarily the best either, right? If you're like twice a year, you're like, oh, these things don't spark joy. Let me buy 100 other things that do spark joy.
I totally
And then
agree
get
with
rid of
you.
them too. Yeah.
And unfortunately, we see a lot of that, especially with e-commerce nowadays. It's so easy to buy something and then get a refund or throw it away. And it's just,
Absolutely. You're totally right about that.
I agree. So we need to lengthen the lifespan of everything that we buy. I totally agree with that. So now I want to talk about your company, Last Minute Gear, because I think it's so cool what you're doing. It's kind of like you're sort of, what's the word? Like bucking the trend. Because when society tells everybody like, oh, you need to buy more, like you need to get on with the latest technological trend, you're saying no, we need to take a step back, we need to downsize, we need to degrowth and focus on that. And your company embraces the philosophy of circular and sharing economy. So can you tell us about your journey as an entrepreneur and how you decided to found Last Minute Gear and what it's all about?
Yeah, of course. When I left my last job, I literally had a day where I sat down and I wrote down all the issues that I cared about. And it was a very long list, let me tell you. And then I started bucketing these issues and I started drawing branches and doing research and understanding what really caused one or the other. I really realized that our attitude around consumption fuels a lot of bad practices. Because, as we were just talking about, we have an attitude about throwaway, about just buy it, and then toss it, about not really caring about something when we have it. If I could change that practice, there is an opportunity to engender a lot of positive outcomes because that practice extends to our relationship with stuff, with the stuff that we buy, with food, right? In terms of food waste, in terms of water and electricity use. It's just this general throwaway mindset that I really want to tackle. To be honest, I didn't want to be an entrepreneur. I've actually always been a really low risk person. That's why I was a management consultant, right? As a joke.
No, we get it. And it pays well, so.
So for me, I looked at every possible option to not start this company, honestly. honestly. So I looked at all the companies that were doing similar things, innovating around not buying stuff. Even though they existed, a lot of them didn't have the incentives to make a social and environmental impact. So a lot of companies today offer rentals. They offer rentals of their entry-level items that are low quality because they're using it as a marketing tool to get you to buy their nicer things. The nature of that model and the incentives that they have behind it, it doesn't make the biggest impact it can. And so that's when I decided, okay, I'm really passionate about this. I'm just going to have to do it myself because it doesn't really exist today. And so I built Last Minute Gear, and we are the only outdoor gear shop, I believe, in the world where we offer 3 ways that people can get gear. So you can buy, you can rent, or you can borrow. And my innovation is constantly around how do I build alternatives to buying for folks? Some people should buy stuff. Like, for example, if you are someone who goes camping every single month, we see a rule of thumb that it's usually the minority of folks that go all the time. If you look at the outdoor industry statistics in the US, people go on average once or twice a year. If you go once or twice a year, your incentive is to buy something that is not quality because you're trying to save money. And so I wanted to really flip these incentives on its head. Our rental program, which is very much sharing economy, by the way, we're increasing utilization of an asset. We're not trying to rent out the lower end versions of stuff. We carry the highest end versions of rent because that's where we can really make a meaningful impact. That's where it adds value to you as a consumer to rent something. And it helps close that access gap because we're saying, hey, if you can't afford to buy something, you don't have to settle for renting something that's really cheap. You can get the nicest thing, even if you couldn't otherwise afford it.
Wow. No, that is excellent. So what are some of the challenges around your business then?
All the incentives are stacked against this. It's really funny because honestly, I had no idea when I got started because everything is oriented to buying, right? And so when I set up this business and I was looking for insurance, because every business has to have insurance, right? It was so hard to find an insurance provider because most insurance companies were like, wait, why would you take on the additional risk of having someone return something to you and then you rent it out again? Right. That's just additional risk, right? Even in terms of our relationship with our suppliers, a lot of suppliers, they want you to buy stuff every year. Stuff comes out every single year that's honestly marginally different, but there is this huge pressure to carry that latest model. It's a pressure from the suppliers that want you to have a relationship by having minimum purchases. It's a pressure from consumers that want to get that latest model. So there's a lot of these incentives that are stacked against you. And I think the biggest tell that our economy is so skewed around consumption is, companies like Patagonia. I really admire Patagonia, by the way. One, they have a huge environmental ethos. They have had, for the past couple of years, they've had an anti-Black Friday campaign. I admire them because they're probably one of the only companies to admit that all these things they do that are anti-consumerism have actually increased their sales. If you look this up, you can see Patagonia's anti-Black Friday, despite that it was anti-Black Friday, was great marketing for it as a company. And I remember I was actually at a talk where a woman from Patagonia, from their marketing department, said straight up, she was like, one of the biggest things that we have to fundamentally struggle with is that we are a retail business and we make money when people buy things. And that's fundamentally counter to the mission that we'd like to have, which was a super powerful statement because I think for me, Last Minute Gear is my opportunity because it's a very small business that I started to figure out, can I avoid being in that situation? Can I make the financials work for a business model that is not buying from the get-go?
Absolutely. And that's why I think it is so noble that you decided to take a risk on this idea. And even though you admitted yourself that you were a risk adverse individual, which is why you went down that safer route of being a management consultant. But it's so clear to me that you're so passionate about environmental sustainability that you decided to start your own company because there is no other company that embraces this philosophy. And I think lending out high-end goods, that makes sense because why would you borrow something that's so cheap that you can just buy from the dollar store? It's almost like a wedding dress business. No one buys a wedding dress.
Yeah, exactly. And it's good that you bring that up because a lot of the services exist today that are sharing services for rentals. So think about, Airbnb, car rental companies like Get Around or Relay Rides, or think about Rent the Runway. They're all for higher value items. Whereas for me with Last Minute Gear, I'm trying to think like, can we make that also work for lower asset value items? Because lower value asset items are just transacted more often,
Yes.
Back in the sharing economy heyday, there was this quote, on average, an electric drill is used for 7 minutes in its lifetime, on average.
I am so guilty of that because I bought one and you're so right. I only used it once.
Yeah, and they last forever. So, all the services that heretofore existed for lower value asset items, they don't exist. It's really hard in this space to fail. And so for me, I was very much trying to feel like, can I use and leverage technology, as I was saying earlier, to make this succeed for the first time and to create a viable alternative for people for the first time for these kinds of products.
I love it. And what I love the most about your business idea is that even though on the surface, it doesn't seem like you're pursuing some newer, sexier technology, but you're basically utilizing what's already out there because we produce so much goods every year. And the problem right now is not producing enough, but we overproduce everything. So you're like, how can I, instead of, chasing some newer frontier technology, why don't I tackle the problem at hand? Now I want to talk about Why is it important to not only chase after frontier technological solutions, but look at addressing these existing problems, such as consumerism and overproduction and underutilization of resources, and scaling existing solutions to help combat climate change?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct. This is a perfect segue and a perfect tie to what we were talking about at the very beginning. There's very much a question of, what if technology just can't solve all your problems?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you find new planets that we can move to, when we consume all the resources of this planet, then we're just gonna be in a cycle of planet jumping forever.
Correct.
At some point, unless we curb our resource consumption, even if by Moore's law or whatnot, we're continually reducing the amount of resources we need, we still need resources. Even if you were like, okay, James, okay, those are future problems for people like millennia down the line. The fact is, in a lot of cases today, our problems come from misallocation of resources. There are studies in the US that show that we waste 40% of food.
Mm-hmm.
And food is about a fifth of landfills, which is the silliest thing considering how many people, even in this country, are going hungry.
Totally. I agree.
Right?
Yeah, I've talked about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, this pandemic, I think, has been even more elucidating, and I hope more people are aware of this, but what happened was when the pandemic happened and all these businesses shut down, it was really hard to change a system that was largely built for commercial level consumption. So a lot of food, for example, is not purchased by you and I, it's purchased by restaurants, it's purchased by food service businesses. It's really hard to pivot that to groceries because you can't move a supply chain that quickly, that's at that scale. So what happened in the US was we saw over the pandemic, people like farmers literally were pouring out 3 million gallons of milk per day. Millions of chickens and pigs just got completely slaughtered. And at the same time, of course, you read articles about how many people are lining up at food banks because they've lost their jobs and they can't afford anything. And grocery stores are running out of things. And simultaneously, you have this massive food waste. It's crazy.
It's heartbreaking. Yeah.
And so for me, a lot of these questions, around like, how are we going to feed this many people? We have the food, Sometimes it's not just a misallocation of resources, it's just a perverse incentive of what you do. And this is something that I think about a lot.
Totally.
Because it really underlies everything. So for example, like fast fashion, right? So we talk about fast food and fast fashion. So the whole idea of fast fashion is that you don't have a season. You no longer have a fall season. You no longer have a spring season. You instead have new stuff coming out every single week because that's a way to feed the consumer beast, right? You're feeding people's immediate changes in preference and taste. The incentive of fast fashion is that things have to continuously come out and they have to continuously be new and different. And you can't really reuse things because if you could reuse things, why would people buy stuff? Back in 2010, there was an expose of, this happened in New York City, of an H&M store where there were all these bags and bags and bags full of new clothing with the tags on that were dumped because, per the speed at which fast fashion operates, if you can't sell it, you got to dump it, and you can't keep it because then it's out of style because that's fast fashion. They dumped it with holes cut out in the clothes so that it couldn't possibly be reused again, which is again crazy considering how many people don't have clothing and are living on the streets and are cold. And it's just the incentives don't add up for behaviors that we inherently, that you and I and everyone listening, that we know these are good behaviors, and instead we can't do them because we live in a system that all the incentives are stacked against us from doing these things.
Totally agree. No, everything you've touched on, I feel it to the bone because I've also covered some of these issues with fast fashion and food waste on my previous podcast. And these are huge, huge issues. And don't get me wrong, there are many companies out there really trying to reinvent the game, right? I've spoken about there are a lot of sustainable brands who are against fast fashion because you're right, fundamentally, this is what we're doing. There are people who are starving. There are people who who are dying of cold. And meanwhile, there are people, and we're overproducing in the textile industry, the food industry, and this problem is huge. But so let's talk about how can we sort of shape people's behavioral patterns, because you're right, the rich just keeps buying more stuff that they don't need, and the poor cannot even afford it. Like, how do we solve that problem? I mean, this is a huge problem because it's basically social inequality.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the number one thing is you have to give people an option. So that's, for example, Last Minute Gear, we're trying really hard to build a super viable alternative to buying stuff. So the other example that I would have for you, this is something that you've touched upon in your previous podcast, is food. So right now, like, look at all the fast food companies that are partnering with companies like Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat to offer viable alternatives. And that's great. I think it's so great. So one thing that I learned from your podcast was the whole 70 billion farm animals.
Oh God, yes, and 69 billion of our chicken. I was just like blown away.
And over 2 trillion fish. Those statistics are just mind-boggling to me. So I'm vegetarian, and in the last couple of years, I've definitely seen that I go to a grocery store and there's so many fake meat alternatives nowadays. You know, and it's funny because I don't really eat a lot of fake meat because I like vegetables themselves.
Same.
I don't need pretend, right?
Yeah.
But it's funny because when I bring stuff to a potluck, I will often bring fake meat and I will often be praised for how good something tastes, because that's the quality and that's the degree to which we can get really good fake meat nowadays. And then I'm just smiling to myself and being like, wow, people have no idea, but this isn't meat.
I think you're right. On the supply side, we need to do more, and we need to give consumers more options. But also on the consumer side, we need to educate them to make better choices for themselves when we do present them with these options. But for yourself, for example, you're a small business owner and you're going up against behemoths like Amazon, and they've already reached economies of scale. So of course, it's easier for them to bring down the prices. But for you, you don't have them right now. So how would you tackle those challenges when you're going up against these already established companies who are offering alternatives at a lower price?
I wish I had a perfect answer for you, because if I did, I think that I would be super successful as a business and we'd be in multiple locations and be operating ourselves.
Don't lose hope.
I know, right? So I don't have a perfect answer for you. I think you just have to try. One of my big bets on making Last Minute Gear financially sustainable is investing so much in technology, and specifically, as I mentioned, our self-service pickup technology. That's really important for us. And it's funny because Amazon has their Amazon Go stores now, right? Yeah. And I always tell people, it's like, I made the Amazon Go store before Amazon Go. The other thing that I really have hope for is the shop local and shop small movement, because I think a lot of people are more aware of the power their dollars have and their ability to vote with their dollars. And we actually get customers, and I hear this from my small business owner friends as well, who choose to come to us specifically because we are not a large business. There's no perfect silver bullet solution here. There's a lot of things that you're going to have to piece together, and never forgetting to invest yourself in technology, because fundamentally that's where we're at. We're in a very high-tech world, and you have to be able to compete in that way.
Totally. It's funny because when you were working at Bain, literally you were helping other companies grow. Like, that's your job as a management consulting, to help businesses grow. And now you're like, no, I'm against this philosophy.
Well, so, I will say the one good thing about Bain is that they're very good about taking into account your preferences for projects. So I'm like a very outspoken person. I straight up was like, I will not work in these industries. And I didn't have to. This process of working there, of talking to traditional investors, of being turned down by traditional investors. For the longest time, I'm always like, I wish I could be more seen and validated by traditional investors, by traditional companies. But in the last, I would say 3 years, this other seed has started germinating in me where I'm like, but what if that's not what I meant to do? What if I meant to prove that an alternative can work?
Correct.
And I've started to really lean into that. And it's funny. It's very therapeutic in a way. It's like almost accepting this thing where you're like, oh, yeah. I'm fighting it,
You're
But
the
like,
counterculture now,
Right. It's okay.
The true hippie.
True hippie. So, for example, one of the things that I'm really into is the Buy Nothing project, which is a project. It's on Facebook groups where people share stuff. They post things that they're giving away. They post things that they want, and it's completely built around free sharing. And a lot of articles have actually talked about the Buy Nothing project and how it spurred amazing community relationships that you otherwise wouldn't have. Like I actually, it's funny because none of these people are my actual neighbors. But I've made connections with people in the city of San Francisco who, like, I haven't really met them, but I feel comfortable reaching out to them because we've shared so much stuff with each other.
No, this is really great, James. And especially learning that you're a vegetarian, just, it's so heartwarming because, James and I were both part of the Work on Climate community. I just have to promote it. And no, like, Cassandra did not pay me, although she should. I'm kidding. But no, it's a fantastic organization. It's workonclimate.org. It's a group of people who are passionate about climate issues. And I've met so many fantastic people on there, entrepreneurs, activists, all sorts of people, like including James. And that's how we met and connected. So James, thank you so much for sharing your insights and wisdom and your incredibly inspiring story from consultant to small business owner. I just wonder how many small business owners out there are wishing that they could be a consultant and they hear your podcast and they stay right where they are. So can you just share with us like your social media information so people are like, how can people get in touch with you? Because I'm sure there are people from the audience who are like so energized by your idea and they want to work on this idea with you to help you grow it further.
Yeah, so I will say I'm a terrible millennial in the sense that I'm not really on social media.
He's hipster. He's off grid, right?
So not totally off grid. I mean, like I have a Facebook, for example, but I don't, honestly, I kind of have a Facebook just because of the Buy Nothing project and a few other groups that I'm really active in. But I will say I am super, super responsive to email, and it's just james@lastmingear.com. Our website is lastmingear.com. The minute is not spelled out.
The lastmingear.com.
Yes, lastmingear.com.
Yeah, James, thank you so much for being on the show today. I've learned so much from you. Like, you have no idea. Like, your information density is incredible. Like, every minute I was just being fed all this information and statistics and examples you were giving. And I definitely hope that we can promote this movement around degrowth and minimalism and just reducing our consumption and being more mindful about it, because my podcast it's all about that. So I'm in full support of what you do, and I really hope to see Last Minute Gear take off. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, listeners, for tuning in today to Make Peace Not Beef. Once again, today on the show, we were with James Dong, the founder of Last Minute Gear. Please feel free to reach out to him if you have any questions or comments, or if you want to get involved with the Buy Nothing project. And I hope you learned something new today, but I will see you in the next episode.